Hello, and apologies for not being able to attend in person today. My name is Avery, and I just recently completed my Master's in Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookes University. Today I will be presenting on my research in Haiti on transitional shelters. As most of you know, the transitional shelter approach was adopted by many NGOs following the earthquake. Emergency shelter provisions were provided in the immediate aftermath, but when it was recognized the reconstruction process would take a number of years, the need for a more durable solution like T-shelters was necessary. The idea was that they would eventually transition to permanent housing over time. It is a critical time for T-shelter occupants in Haiti. 3.5 years, now 4, after the earthquake, represents an important juncture as typical T-shelters are only designed to last 3 to 5 years. As the structures erode, they will become increasingly unsafe for occupants. It is essential that the transitional process is underway. My research consisted of evaluating T-shelters from 3 NGOs, which I have anonymized as NGO A, B, and C. This was done through semi-structured interviews conducted with current and former NGO staff members and 30 beneficiaries of each NGO. Additionally, T-shelter conditions were visually assessed and documented to illuminate reports. None of the 30 NGO A beneficiaries transitioned their T-shelter. The closest any beneficiary has gotten has been a few small efforts towards upgrading. Beneficiaries chosen were among the most vulnerable and highly vulnerable communities. They were not able to improve their own T-shelter, and in many cases were not able to earn a living because of their high vulnerability. The T-shelters provided by NGO A were comparable to traditional rural homes, Creole-style timber structures. They fit in with the cultural norms without upgrades. It may not have even occurred to beneficiaries to upgrade. Should beneficiaries not transition, the conditions they will be living in over time as the shelters begin to deteriorate may not be substantially different from how they were living before the earthquake. Disasters provide an opportunity to reduce vulnerabilities by building back better. NGO A has provided safer housing in the short term but has done little to support sustainable housing in the long term. By giving someone a house that is comparable to what they had before, but perhaps constructed more safely, that person will only live in safe housing for the life of the shelter. In a few years' time, beneficiaries will likely be back to square one because they have not yet been provided with resources such as shelter maintenance information, safe reconstruction training, or sufficient livelihood support. NGO B did not do anything to facilitate the transitional process. According to NGO B informant, the idea was to make as many T-shelters as possible in as little time as possible. There was no substantial integrated livelihoods project and no information or trainings on T-shelter maintenance or safe construction provided other than on an ad hoc basis. NGO B may have provided safe shelters in the interim. However, if or when beneficiaries go to transition, these T-shelters, they are likely to construct similar unsafe structures to those that exist before the earthquake. According to NGO B, there was pressure to meet target completion deadlines, so much so that it ended up being the driving force of the project. This was partially related to the gap period between the first T-shelter project manager leaving and the new one arriving. While NGO B did the best they could with the time and resources they had, much of what they were able to do or not do was dictated by donors, specifically the donors' timetable. After conducting a similar evaluation to my own in 2011, NGO B realized most people were not going to be able to transition themselves, but by that time, the tide had turned on T-shelters and there was no longer funding available for T-shelters or upgrades. There were cluster reports stating Leogane was covered for shelter, though the figures were highly disputed. As a result, NGO B's shelter department pulled out of Leogane due to lack of funding. NGO C's program was able to be extremely flexible and adapt to the needs of people, largely because they did not have to rely on donor funding. NGO C returned to upgrade the T-shelters from tarp walls to cement cladding walls, increasing its lifespan up to 5 to 15 years. Few or no upgrades, aside from pouring a foundation, were made by most. However, since the walls were upgraded, these T-shelters seemed permanent. Interviewees didn't seem in any rush to upgrade, and most didn't have anything in particular they wanted to change other than the size. Beneficiaries did still want to rebuild their old homes, eventually, but reconstruction did not seem to be within the foreseeable future for most. Some were still using the improvised shelters they built before receiving NGO C T-shelters, as the T-shelter alone was not enough. 6 months after the closing of the shelter program, NGOC began a livelihood program hoping to impact T-shelter beneficiaries' financial ability to maintain or transition their shelters. Steel frame shelters are not typical housing frames in Haiti. Even if beneficiaries are taught to maintain and upgrade these T-shelters, they need to be taught how to safely reconstruct using the tools and materials available to them after the NGOs leave. If a family decides to expand their shelter, they may construct something similar to the building that they had before the earthquake, which collapsed. Safe reconstruction training will help prevent this from happening. The primary method of assistance in all three programs was the direct provision of imported prefabricated T-shelters. This is not how the transitional shelter approach is meant to be implemented, and, in fact, it is specifically advised against. Donors' eagerness to fund a visual deliverable resulted in a T-shelter being implemented as a phase rather than an incremental process. Next, without financial resources, beneficiaries are unable to transition independently. The reason NGOC T-shelters transitioned through upgrades was because NGOC came back to do them. By only giving a family a shelter, vulnerability was slightly reduced. However, their financial situation remains largely unchanged. The funding mechanisms for each program was a major determinant in what each NGO was able to provide to support and facilitate transitioning. NGO A and B lacked the funding to follow up and complete the process, or provide any additional support at all. NGOs A and B also experienced difficulties in staff turnover, which impacted their T-shelter programs. With the limited amount of time NGOs have to implement programs, often due to funding stipulations, adequate capacity and consistent staffing is critical. Next, safe reconstruction has not been occurring. 6 of 8 interviewees started construction unsafely, likely as a result of insufficient training. There were consistent discrepancies between NGOs' accounts of their activities and the beneficiaries. This has appeared to have stifled transitioning. The long history of NGOs in Haiti has resulted in an unprecedented amount of dependency on outside assistance. Regardless of the people's ability to make changes to their T-shelters, most will not make them if they are expecting NGOs to. These expectations for assistance are so deep-rooted that they have affected Haitians' ability to recover and transition. The complexities of this disaster were enormous, and permanent reconstruction wasn't on any NGO's table. Many NGO interviewees implied that stopgap was simply the best they could do. T-shelters got people into the recovery stage, but everything stopped there. There was no linking relief efforts to development because NGOs could not even begin to meet the overwhelming needs and assist everyone into recovery. This approach may have provided the best possible solution to the worst possible situation. It is difficult to imagine any other strategy would have provided the same kind of protection. For the circumstances, it may not matter that T-shelters did not transition. However, this does not say that the future development work in Haiti does not require improved, sustainable, adequate housing. The assistance methods utilized by these NGOs wasn't done according to the transitional shelter guidelines and were seemingly donor-driven. Donors were focused on funding this one method, whereas the approach requires a combination of methods to be implemented. NGOC was the only NGO studied that did not rely on donor funding, and the outcomes of their T-shelters were clearly the most successful. It seems likely that if donor funding had fewer stipulations, NGOs would be able to implement more diverse programs based on need. Financial limitations have been a primary barrier to transitioning. Haitian families would benefit substantially from small grants to assist them in the shelter upgrades or reconstruction. Additionally, NGOs need to improve communication with communities so that beneficiaries will be less expectant and hopefully not wait to take action on their housing situation. Beneficiaries must be provided with more safe construction information, such as booklets detailing ways they can upgrade or transition in safe ways to do so, not only with a specific shelter model, but with local construction practices, tools, and techniques. The Haiti shelter response was narrow, and the primary method of assistance was the direct provision of T-shelters. The way to reach the most vulnerable populations is through a wide variety of assistance methods that will address the varying needs and situations. Similarly, a more multi-sectoral approach with a robust livelihoods program may have provided beneficiaries with the financial resources to upgrade or transition their T-shelters. Beneficiaries cannot be expected to make the transition on their own if they do not have the resources. NGOs should be returning well after the project is finished to evaluate their long-term impact in order to improve their effectiveness in future responses. It is recommended that donors are more thoroughly educated on the processes and intricacies of humanitarian responses so that they may be able to more appropriately and effectively fund disaster responses, recovery, and development. Similarly, NGOs should be well informed on the importance of an integrated multi-sectoral shelter response that, regardless of the situation complexities, adequately link relief, rehabilitation,